The history of the West has been mostly Christian.
So how do people who claim a Christian faith reconcile what happened here with what they believe?
I'm utterly ashamed of it.
The crowds listening to him called back, "God wills it."
10,000 European crusaders broke through Jerusalem's walls.
Religious violence becomes an accepted norm.
I hardly know what to say.
Sacrifice, service, affinity with the victims, courage, and above all, humility.
The Christian insistence that if those things are good, they are good for everybody and they are always good. I think that was transformational.
And Christians were doing this in a period when their own legal status was tenuous at best, and sometimes they were being fed to the lions.
This was where Adolf Hitler proclaimed his vision for the Third Reich.
Diseases, land grabs, and outright massacres led to the annihilation of entire communities.
For someone to say love your enemies, that just sounded foolish.
What's the basis for such a declaration?
It simply wasn't the case in the ancient world and hasn't been the case in most of human history.
The Hammer of She-Witches was a bestseller.
Martin Luther King, stand up for what's right, stand up for justice.
It's a big claim to say that it's religiously motivated.
He was worried that they were going to take over the Roman world by the stealth of their good deeds.
They were so successful in lobbying the government on this point that there was state funding for education in India long before it existed in England.
It's surprising that every woman in the Roman Empire didn't become a Christian overnight because the advantages were so great.
Father Damien was one of the first to put up his hand for the arduous journey.
You can resist a system but still love individuals.
If that sounds like a modern message, it's because Jesus' teaching influenced our world more than we realize.
Put it in practice and you'll have a major contribution to a peaceful world.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here with you. Has anyone seen the movie? A bunch of you, great. Okay, well I hope you continue to seek it out. There's an upcoming screening, I think on the 25th of September, but you can look on betterandworse.film to get the details. So today's presentation, is it coming up at some point? I couldn't resist, because I'm in the land of neighbours. I had to call it Everybody Needs Good Neighbours. So, whoops, hang on, let's go back. There we go. Now, the central premise of this show was that if you've got good neighbours, you'll be okay. One of its directors of the show said that the reason that it connects is that a lot of people lead very isolated lives, and what Neighbours does is provide a sense of belonging to a large social network. So people have quite traumatic things happen to them in the show because it's a melodrama, but at the end there are reassuring solutions. So the show sends the message that your network will help you through. So if you've got good neighbours, you'll be okay. And yet I want to juxtapose this with C.S. Lewis's depiction of hell in The Great Divorce. In that book, hell isn't a burning lake of fire or a place of torment, but a dreary, grey town that is expanding indefinitely. The inhabitants of this town are destined to drift further and further apart because they just can't get along with each other. Living with each other and tolerating each other is just too much hard work. So this is a neighbourhood without its crucial ingredient, neighbours. People who are there for each other and are deeply involved in each other's lives. And if we are intrinsically social creatures, then alienation and atomization and no sense of fellow feeling for each other would actually be hell. Now today I want you to keep these two images of the neighbourhood in mind. The increasingly divided neighbourhood that we see in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, and the good neighbours premise that made Neighbours so popular. Because they symbolise what I want to talk about today in the context of Australian culture. On the one hand, the loss of social cohesion and increasing, on the other hand, increasing tribalism in public life. And I want to suggest today what the church can offer to both. Okay, the sense of alienation on one side and increasing tribalism in public life. Now, social researcher Rebecca Huntley says Australia is a suburban nation. Yes, the beach is important to our national identity, and so is the bush. But really, we are a nation of suburbanites. And it's the burbs that we most call home. Now, I don't know about you, but I have really fond memories growing up in the suburbs. I remember it's where that I learned to ride a bike, where we hung out with the kids in the neighbourhood. I remember I had an elderly neighbour called Isaac who let us go into his backyard because it had what looked, to my childish perspective, a really large hill that we used to just roll down. But I went back when I was a little bit older and I realised it's actually not that big, but it seemed endless. I just remember this green grass, the hill hoist, the blue sky. Such a wonderful memory. I'm very nostalgic about it. And yet, this way of life that the suburbs often represent to us, this sense of belonging, is under stress. Social researchers report that many Australians no longer feel a solid connection to their community and the people in it. Hugh Mackay says that many Australians mourn the breakdown of community, the loss of social cohesion. Now, it's more common for people to feel like a stranger in their own street. Research from Edith Cowan University has found that only 35% of people trust their neighbours. Only 35% of people trust their neighbours. And this doesn't mean that the rest of us have untrustworthy neighbours. It's just that we don't know our neighbours well enough to know if we can trust them. So as a result, our neighbourhoods are increasingly lacking a sense of belonging. Now, a key implication of this breakdown in community is lower social capital. And this is defined by Andrew Lee as networks of trust and reciprocity that link multiple people together. So we're talking about the connections between people that give rise to trust, mutual support and care, all of which enriches community life. Mackay says the local neighbourhood is the nursery of social capital. He says because neighbourhoods give rise to incidental interactions between neighbours, and neighbours who, generally speaking, didn't choose to live in close proximity to each other. By having those incidental interactions, you can get the sense that, a basic level of cooperation is going to be really good for all of us. It's going to make the community a nice place to live. So it's as though when you move into a neighbourhood, you take your place as a member of that neighbourhood. So to some degree, you accept responsibility for other people as well as yourself. And this doesn't mean that you need to become best friends with your neighbour. But it means that, it might be nice to know their name, to collect their mail while they're away, to check on an elderly neighbour every now and then, and said hi to people as you pass them in the street. These are the memories that I have of my neighbourhood. I can't say I feel the same in the neighbourhood that I live in now. But that kind of neighbourly interaction helps to increase a community's social capital. Now, lower levels of social capital mean lower levels of trust overall. And trust matters because it's a form of social glue that helps us to live well alongside each other, to give each other the benefit of the doubt when irritations and issues arise, as they do, when you live in close proximity to other people. I have 2 young, very noisy boys, and I live in an apartment. I need my downstairs neighbour to like me. I need him to trust me and for him to trust that I'm doing what I can to contain the hurricanes in the house, okay? If we don't know each other or feel connected to our communities, we risk social isolation. We risk a sense of alienation at the extreme. And it's really tragic and common, more common than you might think nowadays, that someone might actually die in their house and not be discovered for a long time because no one's checking in on them. So why do we feel like strangers in our own streets? Here's a few culprits mentioned in the literature. It's not a definitive list. Firstly, the rise of the 2-income household. If both people are working, then this means that they just have less time to be involved in the life of their community. And even more so if they work long hours, which the trend is that Australians do, and if they have a long commute to get to work as well. People are also concerned about less secure employment. People really feel an almost permanent sense of insecurity, says Rebecca Huntley. Australian workers of all kinds are talking about how difficult they find it is to maintain their sense of security at work. They feel like they have to run to stand still, to work harder for longer just to keep their position. So you can imagine that if people are so anxious about their job security, they're going to invest a lot of time at work as well. There's also family breakdown and the falling birth rate. About 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. And even if you consciously uncouple, if you divorce well, that still send ripples throughout your networks. It has effects on your children, obviously friends and family. And women are also having fewer children as well. And children, of course, are the great social lubricant. They force you to talk to other people, even just to say, I'm so sorry, my child did that. There's also the rise of the single-person household. This is our fastest growing household type. It accounts for 1 in 4 households now, and it's projected to increase to 1 in 3 by 2030. And this doesn't mean that solo house dwellers are particularly isolated. It just means that we really need to be thinking about how we can have a good sense of community so that people can be supported. The loss of social cohesion is also seen to be a result of an increased move to apartment living, as opposed to the great Australian dream of the house with the backyard on the quarter-acre block. Ipsos did a report in 2008, and it found that Australians of all ages tended to think that apartments didn't produce a sense of belonging, and reinforced a very modern tendency for us to not actually get to know our neighbours at all. As one man said in a news article, loneliness in Sydney is just going to increase. The way we're going with high density living, it reduces contact with neighbours. I moved into a group of townhouses 5 years ago, and we enter our house by the basement car park. I can go for days without opening the front door. We just don't see neighbours anymore. There's also one more reason for the loss of social cohesion: increased ethnic diversity. Andrew Lee's Disconnected found that as ethnic diversity in a neighbourhood goes up, the levels of social trust go down. And I guess this makes sense. If you only speak one language and there are many languages spoken in your neighbourhood, then when you talk to your neighbours, if you do talk to them, given all these stresses on the social cohesion in a neighbourhood, you actually just won't know how to communicate with them properly. So there's that. But then we also have to acknowledge that there is a kind of like a slight suspicion, a slight wariness, a slight fear, perhaps, of people who are unlike us. And if you look around your street and your neighbourhood and you start to see more and more people who don't look like you, then it's not long before you might start to feel like a stranger in your own hometown. As one participant of a focus group said, and this is a Sydney example, I sometimes take a bus to Maroubra from the city, and I'm the only white sort of person on the bus. You do feel alienated. It's a horrible feeling. Now, this relies on a bit of local knowledge of Sydney. I grew up next to Maroubra, so I can tell you, I know what this means. This means that the bus was full of loud Chinese people, okay? And not of the crazy rich variety who have extreme wealth to kind of like make them slightly interesting. The finding that ethnically diverse suburbs are less trusting overall doesn't mean that Australians are uniquely prejudiced when it comes to race. Andrew Lee has cited research from all over the world that shows that the higher a community's ethnic diversity, the lower the sense of belonging. The harder it is for people to feel like they belong to each other. And mere exposure to difference doesn't help either. Political scientist Ryan Enos has found through experiments in the US that simply being exposed to two men speaking Spanish in a train made the commuters, who are mostly white, mostly liberal, have increasingly conservative attitudes to immigration. That's just hearing a different language, and people found that really unsettling. So token exposure to ethnic difference is just not going to cut it. It can actually harden people's prejudices against ethnic others. But whatever the case, this finding that ethnic diversity, as it rises, trust falls, it casts a different light on our national narrative as a multicultural nation. As of the 2016 census, 33% of us was born overseas. That's 8 million out of a population of 24 million. Our 33% born overseas is far ahead of Canada's 22%, Germany's 15%, and the US's 13%. So really, we are the true nation of immigrants. And on the one hand, we feel really positively about this. In 2017, the Scanlon Foundation, their annual survey, which they've been doing for 10 years, and maps social cohesion, It found that at least 83% of Australians agree that multiculturalism has been good for the country. And this has been reported this way, as in people feel really positive towards multiculturalism, since that question was first asked in 2013. So people consistently say that they're good, that they feel good about it. And yet, I think it's hard to deny that racism is our Achilles heel. I mean, we think about our support tacitly, if not explicitly, for offshore detention. I think of our inability to kind of come to grips with Aboriginal Australia and Aboriginal people. I think about how we tend to overestimate the level of Muslim immigration and how wary we feel about the threat that they pose to our way of life. The Scanlon survey also found that 41% of respondents are particularly negative towards Muslims, based on a fear that some Muslims reject these secular democratic values. And in the 10 years of the survey, those reporting discrimination on the basis of their skin colour, their religion, their ethnicity, has more than doubled, from 9% in 2007 to 20% in 2017. And of course, I know where I am, in Melbourne. In Melbourne this year, there's been this really politicised narrative that sparks fears of African crime gangs. In January, Peter Dutton said, people are afraid to go out at night because they don't want to be assaulted by these crime gangs. And in July, Malcolm Turnbull said, there's a real concern about Sudanese gangs in Melbourne. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm across this at all, but I have seen these statistics from the Victorian Crime Agency, which says that Sudanese Australians commit 1% of crime in the state versus the 71.7% of crime committed by native-born Australians. So the attention given to the crime committed by one part of the community seems wildly disproportionate compared to the reality. This negative media portrayal risks further alienating those who already feel alienated. This is what Andrew Guy, a South Sudanese refugee turned family worker with Anglican, had to say in a Guardian column. He wrote, "Some of these young people who've gone off the rails are simply rebelling against society that they feel is rejecting them." So for Guy, this antisocial behaviour stems from a sense of unbelonging to the Australian community. He drew attention to the difficulties that both parents and children faced when navigating the increased freedoms and complexities of Australian culture. And also the fact that there's widespread unemployment within this community, even though its members have done all they can education-wise to get themselves the training and qualifications that they need. He's also talking about how the police tend to engage with members of this community with a chronic suspicion that they're up to no good. So Guy recommended instead, why don't we build a positive sense of belonging in people? And he said that sporting groups and youth groups could actually foster that sense of belonging. And I think this represents a really powerful opportunity for the church. Repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, we have God calling on his people to show concern for the alien in your midst. So it seems fairly straightforward, right? Have compassion on the stranger among you in your midst. But then I do have to ask as well, are there immigrants in your midst? I want to read you a couple of lines by Michael Spence, who's the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. He's talking about Sydney, but does this apply in your town as well? He says, Sydney, we are told, is a city of villages, but it could equally be called a city of ghettos, and ghettos defined not just by ethnicity and religion, but by socio-economic status and even sexuality. It is possible to live one's whole life in this city, essentially encountering only people just like oneself. While some parts of the city reflect the multiculturalism of which our governments boast, much of it looks like a loosely sewn together patchwork of monocultural spaces. So his point is that we are really tribal. We cluster together in communities of people just like us, and we just don't engage with each other, sometimes because of tensions within different communities or between communities, but more often than not because we simply don't feel an obligation to reach out to other people. So the success of our multiculturalism, in other words, might not be the outcome of a hard-won struggle, but might just more be a product of just like mild indifference to each other. I used to teach a bunch of international students, predominantly from China and Hong Kong. And I remember after class one day, some of them started confiding in me about how unwelcome they felt in the community, how the other students on campus ignored them and didn't engage with them in a meaningful way. So, what if Christians were not satisfied with merely peaceful coexistence with those who are different to us? What if Christians actively sought out their more diverse neighbours in order to get to know them and to serve them, and in a way that goes beyond a token encounter with difference, but gives everyone the opportunity to develop real and lasting friendships? And like, sure, sometimes the other doesn't want to engage, but then of course God doesn't give up on us. He made himself vulnerable to our rejection, so perhaps that's also the least that we can do, make ourselves vulnerable to rejection by the other. And yeah, it's also going to mean signing up for awkward or difficult encounters with other people, because it's far from easy to navigate relationships across difference. It requires a lot of goodwill, that we don't give up on each other. But as I said, God doesn't give up on each other, on us as well. Now, I read in the Melbourne Anglican that Philip Huggins, the Assistant Bishop in the Diocese of Melbourne, is taking active steps to foster good connections with religious and community leaders in the South Sudanese community. There's talk of sharing resources, of holding youth camps to encourage a positive transition between primary and secondary school, and also a national conference that would bring together leaders from the community as well as government and civic bodies in order to talk through the issues and brainstorm possible solutions. I think this is exactly where the church needs to be. Reaching out to the marginalised, reaching out across lines of difference, and seeking to do what it can to glue a fractured community back together. And I'm not talking about the South Sudanese community in particular, I'm talking about our whole community. Because if the neighbourhood is the nursery of social capital, then so is the church. I don't have time to play you a clip of what this looks like, but I encourage you to go to the website betterandworse.film, select Browse All Websites, and go down to the one that says Why You Need Christian Neighbours. Okay? I'll mention that later again. So I've said if the neighbourhood is the nursery of social capital, so is the church. If we inhabit an increasingly fragmented community, Christianity provides the valuable social glue that can glue us back together. In American Grace, How Religion Unites and Divides Us, the professor of public policy, Robert Putnam, waded through 2 massive and comprehensive surveys about religion and public life in America, and he came to this conclusion: religious people make better neighbours. He says, for the most part, the evidence we review suggests that religiously observant neighbours are more civic and in some senses, simply nicer. Apparently, religious Americans volunteer more, they give more to charity, they're more involved in civic life than their non-religious peers. Religious people make better neighbours. They're more likely to provide financial aid to family and friends who need it. They're more likely to spend time with someone who's a bit down. And the Australian data points in the same direction. Andrew Lee, who wrote Disconnected and who studied under Robert Putnam, reports that among churchgoers, defined as anyone who's attended a church service in the previous month, among churchgoers, 25% also participated in a community service or civic association over the same period. And that's compared to 12% of non-churchgoers. Churchgoers are also 14 percentage points more likely to affirm the value of altruism, as well as live it out. Regular attendees are 16 percentage points more likely to have been involved in a voluntary activity and 22 percentage points more likely to have helped the needy. Despite many Australians' disenchantment with organised religion, they're not blind to the good that churches do. Hugh Mackay reports that 90% of non-churchgoers like the idea of having a church in their neighbourhood. They may not go to it, but they like that it's there. They think that churchgoers are more likely to be good neighbours who serve the community. Moreover, Andrew Leigh has said that there are few other institutions as the church that are good at fostering what's called bridging social capital. Bridging social capital binds together members of different ethnicities, income levels, religions, etc. Okay, maybe not religions, but differences. Differences don't pose a problem to institutions that are good at bridging social capital. He says that the church is particularly good at bridging the rich and poor divide. And this is no surprise, right? I mean, this is a faith that says that there is a unity among all the believers that can transcend differences between Jew and Gentile, male and female, slave or free. So Leigh concludes, while it is possible to point to examples of intolerance, Australia's religious bodies have on the whole been a force for good, strengthening social capital in both its bonding and bridging forms. Bonding is about joining people together who already are quite similar, right? Bridging is transcending those differences. He says those who attend church regularly are more likely to know someone who could help them out of financial difficulty and to have a friend of a different social class. With the loss of these bonds, we lose a source of mutual understanding in a country that is becoming increasingly unequal. The emptying out of Australia's pews has left us a little less connected than we once were. So in other words, the church can be a powerful force for good because it is full of good neighbours. And I want you to remember that and be really encouraged by that, because our culture is at the point where we've got to set aside special days to remind people to invest in others. Are You OK Day, Neighbour Day, Random Acts of Kindness Day. The church doesn't need special days like that because at its best, neighbourly concern is just what the church does 24/7. But also, think about how you can let your neighbourhood know that you are good neighbours. Because a study out of McCrindle last year found that 56% of people didn't know a lot about their local church. So even if 90% of non-churchgoers like the idea of a church, they don't really know what's really going on in it. There is a disconnect, therefore, between churches and the communities they serve. People in the area seem to have a better knowledge of parks, where to buy good coffee, etc., than the activities of the local church. So how can we address that? I don't know. That's up to you to work out, not me. Okay, I want to broaden our perspective now from the state of our neighbourhood and talk about the state of our national conversation, which seems increasingly polarised. Now, times have been particularly turbulent in Canberra lately, and I'm not even talking about the leadership spill. What about Fraser Anning's maiden speech? Calling, effectively, for a revival of the White Australia policy, a ban on Muslim immigration and an end to tolerance and multiculturalism. He also invoked, whether deliberately or not, the final solution to the problem of immigration. Now, after he spoke, Muslim Labor MP Ed Husic gave a speech where he said that this national moment was an opportunity for the PM and the opposition leader to bring the country together, right? To unite in the face of a speech that sowed division. And he talked about the pain that particularly the Jewish community would have experienced at the phrase final solution in light of his bromance with Jewish Liberal frontbencher Josh Frydenberg, who's probably no longer a frontbencher, probably has a different position in the cabinet, but I don't know now. After Husic spoke, of course, Frydenberg reached out to embrace him. And this image just went viral. It was a powerful symbol of solidarity and friendship across lines of difference, right? Across religious lines, across party lines. And I remember they went on Patricia Karvelis's program to talk about race in Australian politics, and she asked a question that went right to the heart of the matter. How to take this expression of friendship across difference beyond one day. How to actually make it mean something beyond one day. So I was really listening for their answer, and they had nothing good to say, okay? But we have a compelling answer. We have the love of neighbour. We have the love of neighbour that has concern for the other at the heart of its being, and a love that persists in spite of deep differences. Because neighbourly love is sorely lacking in the public square where division is the new normal. Brexit and Trump made 2016 something of a watershed in in politics. These huge upheavals revealed these deep divisions in the UK and the US. And those divisions were often framed as educated elites and ordinary people. The experts, the educated elites, said Trump can't win, as if. They also said Britain shouldn't leave the EU, and here's why. And they said Britain's not going to leave the EU, surely. And yet, when all this stuff happened, when Brexit was passed, when Trump made office, it revealed how out of touch the educated elite, the political class, was with those that they governed. And it's not just differing levels of income and education level that separate elites from everyone else. Plenty would say that race factors into these divisions as well. The Leave campaign, for instance, exploited fears of Muslim immigration by highlighting Turkey's possible accession to the EU, which was extremely remote, it turned out, but it was good for their campaign. And they also released this poster of a huge queue of Syrian refugees called Breaking Point. So they were stoking that fear of Muslim immigration there. And by some strange turn of events, we've had both Nigel Farage, the former leader of the UK Independence Party, instrumental in Brexit, and also Steve Bannon, instrumental in Trump's presidential campaign, in Australia this past week. And both these guys have had to field questions that they aren't stoking racial divisions, that there isn't some sort of racist rhetoric that's underwriting their claims. They've both had to kind of answer questions, are you pitting white people against everyone else? Right? And they say they're not, but race is there somewhere. Now, both Farage, I have no idea if I'm saying his name properly, by the way, please do correct me. Both Farage and Bannon have unnervingly said that the kind of populist revolutions that we've seen abroad are going to come here as well. Steve Bannon, Australia is going to be a hotbed of populism, just knowing that cussedness and grit of the Australian people. The white workers in this country aren't racist. The workers in this country are finally standing up for themselves. It doesn't matter how many liberal journalists come in here and say, oh, this is a bunch of fascists, this is a bunch of Nazis, this is a bunch of racists. This movement is not going to stop. Nigel Farage. We need to openly and honestly discuss immigration. And yes, discuss culture and our Judeo-Christian values, which underpin our entire society. The global revolution of 2016, which you saw in the shape of Trump being elected, and of course Brexit, far from it being a short-term blip, is actually part of a global revolution. If in Australia there is not a greater connection with those who actually want patriotic values, for those who think that immigration needs looking at, if the Liberal Party can't sort itself out, then something, a big shock will come and replace it. Fraser Anning's speech, plus the persistent appeal of One Nation, shows that populist politics is alive and well in Australia. One that relies to a great extent on nostalgia for an earlier time. You can see this in Fraser Anning's speech. He says, 50 years ago, Australia was a cohesive, interesting word, predominantly Anglo-Celtic nation. Most people thought of themselves as Christian of some sort, although most of us didn't go to church all that often. Everyone from the cleaners to the captains of industry had a shared vision of who we were as a people and our place in the world. But this shared vision of an Australian national identity founded on, quote unquote, historic European Christian values is under threat, Anning says. It's under threat by non-European immigrants who are taking over the nation, and by elites, on the other hand, who are too preoccupied with gender fluidity and so on, in order to actually concern themselves with the lives of ordinary people. So Anning bemoaned the loss of a golden age, these are words from his speech, under Joh Bjelke-Petersen, and he announced his intention to address the concerns of rural people that are increasingly kind of like alienated from the major parties. Now, the prevailing narrative that we often apply to populist politics is one of economic disadvantage. This idea that these are the people who have been left behind by globalisation. Rebecca Huntley, I'm interested in what she has to say. She says that prevailing narrative that ties it purely to economics is missing something. She says prosperity is important, but what worries this group is the cultural, social slippage they feel in their life. They imagine their fathers' and grandfathers' lives were better, more certain, easier to navigate. Maybe they were and maybe they weren't, but it's the loss of that that is worrying for them. The economic argument alone isn't persuasive for them. So in other words, populist politics betrays an anxiety of cultural social slippage, of loss of status and place. It actually betrays the anxiety that people feel when they are starting to feel like strangers in their own country. In Political Tribes, Amy Chua's book, she writes, "We find ourselves in an unprecedented moment of pervasive tribal anxiety. For 200 years, whites in America represented an undisputed politically, economically, and culturally dominant majority. Today, no group in America feels comfortably dominant. Every group feels attacked, pitted against other groups, not just for jobs and spoils, but for the right to define the nation's identity. In these conditions, democracy evolves into zero-sum group competition, pure political tribalism." Now, she's talking about America, arguing that the support of Trump among voters was driven by anxiety over shifting power dynamics in the country. She talks about how demographic projections show that white Americans will cease to be a majority in the States for the first time by around 2040. And this phenomenon is called the browning of America. And the result will be a more diverse nation, one where white Australians will still be at least 50% of the population, but it'll be a nation where white people might feel increasingly marginalised as more minority concerns assume centre stage. And to kind of picture this, I wonder if you've seen, or you should be watching, this American cop comedy Brooklyn Nine-Nine. In this comedy, the centre of moral authority is the police captain, who's oh gosh, third from the right, okay? Raymond Holt, Captain Raymond Holt, who's black, clearly, who's also gay, right? The centre of moral authority is him, and then there's this, you can see the cast is quite ethnically diverse. So it's a portrait of a diverse multiracial America. And so funnily enough, who's not pictured in this? These two characters who are the kind of incompetent buffoons that everyone makes fun of in the precinct. Okay, Scully and Hitchcock. It's interesting that Scully and Hitchcock in this portrait of the new America, they're still included, though not in this cast picture, but they are included on the assumption that they're going to be marginalised, as well as mocked from time to time. Now, Amy Chua talks about pervasive tribal anxiety and the fact that no group feels comfortably dominant. She's talking about America, sure, but similar fears are expressed in our own populist politics. These are the fears of white people being marginalised in their own country, of Christian values being lost, of a way of life that is increasingly under threat. Both Fraser Anning and Nigel Farage imply that particularly. Now, if Chua's thesis is right, if she's right that Trump rode a wave of white angst all the way to the White House, then what do we make of the fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for him? I don't know what to make of that, but I'm really intrigued by what Michael Ware has to say. Michael Ware spearheaded Obama's faith outreach efforts in 2012. He says tribalism is to blame. He says evangelicals wanted a candidate who would look out for them, just like every group in this country is looking for a candidate who will look out for them. So here's the question. In an increasingly post-Christian world, where Christianity is falling out of favour, where Christianity is associated with whiteness, whether accurately or not, where Christians look out of touch and irrelevant, if not bigoted and worse, how will Christians respond? Are Christians going to behave like every other tribe, aggressively defending any encroachment on what we perceive to be our territory? Are we going to go along with our polarised political culture and just shout to be heard above everyone else? Or are we going to love and seek out those people that we violently disagree with. And this matters, right? Because how is it possible to have a common life together if we can't even talk to each other? Remember C.S. Lewis's depiction of hell, an atomized neighbourhood where everyone is moving further apart from each other because it's too hard to deal with each other. Now, people who talk about the problem of tribalism often argue that we need to bridge political divides in order to try and have a better conversation with our political others. And of course, that is good advice worth implementing. But Christians have a better reason to do this more than anyone else because Jesus taught us to love our enemies and our neighbours, right? Now, love for neighbours sounds fairly straightforward, but the obvious follow-up question is, well, who is my neighbour? You know, who do I show love to and what's the nature of that love? In other words, who is in my tribe, so I have to love them. I just want to know who's in and who's out. But Jesus, of course, overturns the assumptions of the question. He says, don't worry about trying to nail down who your neighbour is. Just go and be a neighbour to other people. Don't fret about political, cultural, religious differences. Don't let tribal allegiances get in the way of you showing concern for other people. Our tribal instinct is to be hostile to outsiders and open-hearted to those in our own group. But the love for neighbour that Jesus proclaims is open-hearted to everyone and actively seeks the good of other people. As Jesus says elsewhere, being a neighbour to others means that we do to others what we want them to do to us. So if we want people to extend grace to us, then we will extend grace to them, in echo of the God who shows grace to us. If we want people to make the effort to understand where we're coming from, then we will make that effort to understand where they're coming from. We will seek to see them in their own right, rather than persistently see them in a way that reinforces our own biases. And sure, we are still always talking about sin and the possibility of forgiveness, but we want to make sure that we really understand where the other person is coming from. Okay? Now, I'm stoked that we were all touched by Husick and Frydenberg's embrace. I was too. This embrace flouted tribal allegiances that would otherwise estrange people of different beliefs and political persuasions. But I also wonder who is reaching out to Fraser Anning? Who is reaching out to the people that Fraser Anning speaks to? Progressives want nothing to do with Fraser Anning and his ilk. He shows the limit of that tribe's neighbourly love. But the Christian love of neighbour does not discriminate. It doesn't discriminate against anyone, and that's why we could also turn to Fraser Anning and say, if we're going to talk about the loss of Christian values, then what about the love of neighbour that's being lost, especially in your speech? That's the kind of Christian values or product of our Judeo-Christian culture that we should be worried about losing. We shouldn't be worried about losing status, losing privilege, losing access to the establishment. The love of neighbour is a powerful Christian witness in a time of toxic tribalism. In a polarised political culture that gets us to pick sides and regard outsiders with hostility, the logic of neighbourly love flouts tribal allegiances and gets us to expand the sphere of our concern indefinitely. And the end result is that for the Christian, even ideological others are considered as neighbours, worthy of care, love, and respect. So this is what I want to leave you with. We need good neighbours in an increasingly fragmented society. In a time where people increasingly don't feel a sense of belonging in their neighbourhoods, but feel like strangers in their own street, I've argued that Christians are good neighbours because as part of the calling they live out as God's people, they seek to care for everyone, regardless of difference. And this social capital that they contribute has a measurable and admirable effect that people notice. And in a time of increasing political division where some people increasingly feel like strangers in their own country, I've talked about how the Christian love of neighbour is so expansive that it can include enemies. The Christian love of neighbour can encourage Christians not to behave like every other tribe by seeking to protect its own turf. And it can actually empower Christians to seek out everyone, regardless of tribal allegiances. I'm under no illusion that we don't have our work cut out for us. We do. At the local level of the neighbourhood, and at the level of the national conversation. But with God's help, I hope that we can be good neighbours to everyone. Thank you.